thing about hemochromatosis is you could have both of those mutated genes but not develop any of the conditions or not have elevated ferritin. There's never a guarantee. The odds are you will. So really it is about monitoring those levels. Both of my brothers have not had the genetic test. It's recommended that you have the genetic test. They have not. I can't make them. Their doctor's view is that I will continue to test their iron levels. And if it ever elevates to a point of concern, then we will de-iron them. And we'll get their genetic testing to see if
Bleed them.
And we'll see if they have hemochromatosis. But right now, their levels are within a normal range, so we don't have any reason to suspect that they have hemochromatosis. And the reason for that is it can affect your insurance. If you have a genetic disorder, and you know that, you have to tick it off on a box, and it will affect your insurance.
This did not make a lot of sense to me at first, but in researching this inside story and talking to medical experts, what Rayne says is absolutely bang on. Now, no one is trying to cheat the insurance companies, but if her brother's iron levels are, quote, normal, then there's no reason to test them for hemochromatosis. If, however, during those routine tests that there is a problem with their iron levels, her brothers have promised they will take the next step.
When I was home in the summer, I booked an appointment with their doctor and went in and sat down with him to talk about it. And I said, well, it's the protocol that you are supposed to genetically test my brothers. And, you know, this is patient confidentiality. He doesn't need to discuss my brother's charts with me, you know, and we had a very frank discussion and a bit of a debate, and it was quite fun because I love debating. But he said to me, you don't treat hemochromatosis, you treat the elevated levels, right? So it's when I get down to 50, you're not going to be treating my hemochromatosis, my 50 ferritin level, right? I'm going to just be maintaining it.
What are you at right now?
Last week I was at 50. So Linda, I'm going to ask you what my chart is because I've hit that number. I'm waiting for Dr. Larratt to tell me if I just need to keep maintaining it or...
Did the Hemochromatosis Society know what was hitting them here when they had you as a patient?
Yeah, I don't know.
No, they probably didn't. But I can only suggest the society must be grateful for someone like Rayne giving a voice to their cause. I am certainly grateful for all I've learned about hemochromatosis, and I certainly know that I will go to my doctor and ask next time I'm having a blood test to include that. This is Michelle Bowden, back with more of hemochromatosis, the deadliest disease you've never heard of. Back with more right here on 630 CHED. Welcome back to the Inside Story. We are talking about hemochromatosis, the deadliest disease you've never heard of. I'm at the University of Alberta Hospital with my friend Rayne, where she is bloodletting.
Well, I'll book like I did last time and then wait because I know I've...
Linda, the nurse who was bloodletting Rayne, or presiding over the phlebotomy, told us that her previous ferritin levels were at 32. Her goal was to maintain around 50.
So can she get too low, like...
Yes, you can. And you can also go down too fast. That's another thing. And then have problems stabilizing it. So did Dr. Larratt have anything in my chart about changing my protocol, or does she still want me to come every 2 weeks?
The more consistent Rayne's levels, the fewer times she'll need to bleed out or have a phlebotomy. Perhaps even her regular routine of blood donation will suffice.
You do a lot of traveling, though, so what happens if you go away for a month?
Well, I'm not really going to do a lot of my traveling. I'm hoping to have this all taken care of because, as you know, next year I'm going away for 6 months. So I will probably make sure that I plan my treatment just before I leave, and I will hopefully, it's not going to be a crisis when I come back at the end of 6 months and my levels are 150, I may have to do a few phlebotomies to get it back down.
And I suppose you could give blood while you're away, though. I mean,
depending on the countries that I'm in, and I'm going to do some research on that. I'm going to make sure I have a doctor's note and protocol or whatever that I could go in and get a phlebotomy abroad.
But I'm guessing you're still menstruating. Does that affect your levels at all, being a woman who's still...
It definitely does, and that's one of the reasons that women are not diagnosed usually in their 40s like I am, or 30s or 40s. Men usually present with hemochromatosis younger than women, so because of our menstrual cycle. So for me, I may end up having a spike again once I hit menopause because I'll stop that cycle. But right now, it's helping me. As much as some of us call it the curse, this is actually a blessing for me.
Dr. Dawna Gilchrist, a leader in the field of genetic medicine, says people with hemochromatosis don't die of the disease per se, but from the damage that this genetic disorder causes in the body. Liver damage, diabetes, horrific stories of the toxic iron that's poisoning the body. And as you'll hear from Dr. Gilchrist, if you're born with it, there's little chance of avoiding hemochromatosis.
All genes come in pairs, okay? So to get into trouble, you have to have 2 abnormal copies of the gene, okay?
Okay.
If you have 1 abnormal copy of the gene, you might get a little too much iron, but you're not going to get into trouble.
So what do I die of? Anything?
Something else.
Okay.
And let's say you carry a normal iron storage gene and an abnormal iron storage gene. You're perfectly fine. And you marry some nice guy who has a normal iron storage gene and an abnormal iron storage gene. And your first baby ends up with both the abnormal iron storage genes. That individual has genetic predisposition to store too much iron. And it depends on what happens over their life, whether they actually do store too much iron. And if it gets very high, then they could be at risk for cirrhosis and other problems associated with excess iron storage.
Remember, a healthy lifestyle is not a factor here. Have your extra fiber, be a non-drinker. That has nothing to do with hemochromatosis. Not everyone who stores too much iron will develop hemochromatosis, or as Dr. Gilchrist says, will get into too much trouble. Dr. Gilchrist agreed to talk with us today about hemochromatosis, a hereditary disease, one of her specialties. Unlike cancer or other diseases, one can only be diagnosed with hemochromatosis if your parents carry the gene. It's not catchy. You cannot get it through a blood transfusion or through intimate relations, only through heredity.
So depending on what happens in their life, do they eat enough iron or are they, vegan? Do they have heavy periods? Do they have 10 kids? Do they start to be a regular blood donor and continue through their whole life? Your friend may never get into trouble if she manages to keep her iron levels down to a dull roar. So the great thing about this genetic disorder is that it is diagnosable and it is preventable.
If she were to have children, Rayne's kids would automatically become carriers of the gene. That does not mean they'd automatically develop hemochromatosis. But if she were to have children, they would carry the gene regardless of whether her husband is a carrier or not. And here's why, Dr. Gilchrist.
She's got 2 recessive genes.
How do you know that?
Because she's got hemochromatosis.
Oh, and so you know him too?
Okay, so let's say he's got 2 normal genes.
Yeah.
Then the kids will each have a normal gene and an abnormal gene. That's a carrier, but that's okay. So, but if, let's say, she has 2 abnormal genes and he has a normal gene and an abnormal gene,
yeah,
then there's a 50-50 chance that their kids will be normal carriers and a 50-50 chance that their kids will also have hemochromatosis.
Remember, you cannot catch hemochromatosis. You cannot contract it from a blood transfusion. It's a hereditary disease. It is not a virus. A quick note, if I may, about children and hemochromatosis. As an aside, Dr. Gilchrist says even if your child is a carrier and has 1 or more of those genes we've spoken about, it is very difficult for kids to have too much iron. There are other, more rare forms of hemochromatosis, and we're not going to talk about those today on the Inside Story, because, frankly, for most of us, this topic is enough to wrap our heads around. So stick with me on the Hemochromatosis 101 lesson.
Why is this so common? If you were in the Middle Ages, where women were having babies, every other year or every year, if you were able to store a lot of iron, you were probably better able to tolerate 8-10 babies than you would if you got anemic with every baby.
Thank you, Dr. Gilchrist. This makes so much sense. Certain ethnicities, certain religions have more and more babies. Maybe we were born this way. Genetics, it makes so much sense. When we come back, the founder of the Hemochromatosis Society and somebody who's had the disease for going on 3 decades. This is Michelle Bowden, back with more of hemochromatosis, the deadliest disease you've never heard of, right here on 6.